Positively identifying a sword can be a tricky affair. It often comes down to knowledge of models, materials that were used, styles, and you can generally get a good understanding, especially for swords that are mass-produced. So let's say if we're talking about 19th century swords especially, it can be fairly easy to get a overall understanding of what you're looking at. However, when it comes to pinpointing exactly what a sword is or where it comes from, things get way more difficult. And this is because the amount of models and their variety is not necessarily as huge as you may imagine when you consider the whole of Europe throughout at least the period of the 19th century. So what would usually happen, and we're talking of course about European swords here, is that a specific model would be designed and rolled out in a certain country, and then depending on its success, it may be adopted by a bunch of different units, different countries, different armies, and so on and so forth. And this obviously follows lines of cultural and political vicinity, of course. So let's say countries that were either geographically or culturally close to others may adopt similar weapons. We see that a lot, for example, with French swords being adopted in Belgium, for instance, but also in Italy, especially after the Napoleonic phase and especially in certain areas of Italy. And of course, we see a similar pattern in the 1796 British cavalry, light cavalry saber, which was then adopted and cloned into the Prussian Blucher. And all of this is just a reminder of how, while it may be easy to kind of generally attribute certain characteristics to a sword, actually figuring out where it's from exactly may be a completely different issue with a lot more difficulty. And this is of course just the highest level of complexity, because it can be pretty easy to determine what a Blucher is versus an actual British 1796. However, the difficulties increase when you consider that, for example, certain areas like Germany or Italy, at least until the half of the 19th century, were not unified yet. So within these geographical areas that today we see as unified countries, we had a variety of smaller political entities, each one of which may have adopted variants of the initial variant of the initial model of a sword. And this can be easily seen, for example, in the Faszinemesser. So each German entity, if not each, at least several of them, had their own take on the Faszinemesser. And while in certain cases these differences can be broad enough that you can actually easily tell them apart, in some cases it really has to do with the angle of the quillin or the amount of ribs on the grip, for example. And these things require a rather deep understanding of the sword to be able to benefit your identifying efforts. So all of this is to say that precisely identifying a sword beyond a generic German Faszinemesser, for example, or briquette clone can be really complicated. And as sword collectors or sword enthusiasts who enjoy researching them, we must make the best of all kinds of different tools that can aid us in positively identifying a sword. Now, some of these are personal experience, of course. You have online communities that can help you. There's specialized literature that can be very useful. But one element that I've never seen mentioned, actually, and has come in handy more than once in my case, for example, so this is why I'm talking about it today, is heraldry. Now, I won't get into the details of heraldry or its history because it's, well, a whole vast topic in and of itself. So it's something that could take a whole PhD or more to be able to actually understand correctly. But when it comes to the specific aspects of how heraldry may be useful for sword collectors or for identifying swords, the field luckily compresses a little bit. And what really interests us in this case, or at least for this video, is the understanding the context of the set of rules that heraldry has and how these are applied to coats of arms and how that can benefit us. So I'll start with a practical example because that's probably the most useful thing I can do. And I'll show you this saber briquette. So this is the quintessential sword, perhaps, that is hard to describe. You'll find these people asking about these on forums or on social media. And unless it's French, and in that case you usually have very recognizable markings, but in many other cases the general answer, like the standard answer, is it's one of many briquettes, tens of different countries, or there are hundreds of or thousands of potential variations of them, depending on unit, country, and everything. And if you don't really have more to show, it's impossible to tell what it may be. And this was the situation I was facing when I first picked up this briquette. So this one, it was featured in a previous video of mine, and it's a Swiss briquette. But I'll quickly show you what I had to go by. And I hope it's in focus, and if not, I'll put a picture up when I finish editing. But you'll see there's a number, there's a crest, which I hope comes through in focus, and then a couple of letters. So the number, of course, doesn't really help much because it's a unit number or regimental number or weapon inventory number, and all armies had those, so that can be hard to, it may not help. But the coat of arms is what can actually help. Now, if you're looking at the picture, which I hopefully put up on the screen, you'll see that this coat of arms is divided in two by a horizontal line. And the bottom element is just has no pattern to it, whereas the top element has a pattern of vertical lines. Now, if you don't know about heraldry or the basic rules that kind of govern it, you may think that this symbol is equal to the others. So if I don't know what it means, if I don't recognize the crest, it gives me as much information as the number or the letters. However, luckily for us, heraldry is governed by a rather strict set of rules and a historical need to be able to translate color into patterns. Now, I don't want to claim credit for stuff I didn't do because I had to ask external experts to help me identify the sword. At the time, I didn't have that knowledge or understanding of the potential value of heraldry. So this is why I'm now transferring this knowledge to you, and hopefully it'll help you in some situation. So what to the inexperienced eye may seem like a small coat of arms with basically no information. There's no lion, no animal that can help us in a Google search, for example. And it would be hard to search for shield with no pattern at the bottom and vertical lines at the top, for instance. But this, to the eye that has a very cursory understanding of heraldry, you don't need to be an expert in this to be able to identify them. This translates into colors and patterns. So, and this is because, well, as you can see, obviously a marking on a piece of brass doesn't come with color. But as you probably know, most coats of arms and everything do come with colors and patterns to them. So to kind of enable the translation of color into non-colored media, I suppose, and this may be a stamp on metal, but it could also be, for example, the representation of a coat of arms on a print or a book. So at the time, they would have been probably in black and white. So you needed a way to translate a color into something that would have been recognizable to the viewer. And luckily for us, people in the past weren't stupid, and they combined each possible color, or there are more than colors, we'll see that in just a moment, but let's simplify it to color. They combined each possible color used in heraldry to a pattern. So when you see this bottom of the shield, which is basically empty, that actually is communicating information that you can translate into a color. And when you see vertical lines equally, that represents another color. So this means that with a quick understanding of the basics of heraldry, you can look at this coat of arms or many others, which I'll show you a few examples as we move forward, and quickly translate those into something that you can actually look for, search, and understand better. So I mentioned colors, and I mentioned it was a simplification. And this is because the elements represented on a shield or on a coat of arms are, apart from the decorative elements, which would be like weapons or symbols or these kinds of things, but if we're talking about the background, like what would be a color or pattern on a shield, we have what is called a tincture. This tincture is the catch-all term, I think, to represent this kind of element on a heraldic decoration. And tinctures are divided in three. There are metals, there are colors, and there are furs. So this may seem like it's getting complicated. I assure you it's easier than it seems, because the amount of colors, furs, and metals that have been traditionally used are not that many. There may be 10 or 12 of them. Actually, I'll put a graph here on the screen so you can actually follow with me as we go through them. But essentially, we have two metals. These are gold and silver. We have a set of colors that I think are kind of 5 or 6 maybe. And these are specific hues. They're not like primary colors or easy to recognize colors. And also their names, their heraldic names don't really help us because they take, I think, from like Old French or something like that. So, but essentially we have like a green, a red, a blue, and a purple, and a few other colors. And then we have furs, and these are used to represent, of course, you'll probably be familiar with the fact that royal attire or noble attire often had like mink fur or these kinds of furs, and these had a symbology. They weren't just for fashion or looking cool. And they obviously are also represented on coats of arms. Essentially, what is really useful for the sword collector is probably only the metals and colors. So, for example, if we look at the metals, you'll see that gold is symbolized by a pattern, a white pattern with dots, and silver is represented by a clean slate. Moving on to colors, we can see that, for example, well, we'll only look at the first two for now, but we see that the azure or blue has horizontal lines to it, whereas, and what's more interesting for us in this specific case, the red color, or the equivalent of red, which is gules, but we'll call it red, has vertical lines to it. So now we can suddenly turn this marking on a hilt into a true coat of arms, and it's a coat of arms that is represented by a tri-lobed shield. I hope that's the correct term, but let's say a shield with 3 points, kind of, and with a top half that is red and a bottom half that is silver. Now this is something we can actually look for. So when you do that search, you'll actually come up quite soon with the Swiss town of Solothurn. And now these letters, the S and O, kind of give us extra confirmation because Solothurn has that coat of arms, and its initial letters are actually represented next to the marking we have on our hilt. So in just a couple of minutes, by knowing the value of heraldry, we can actually help identify a sword that otherwise would have probably been set aside with countless other briquettes and been like, okay, I don't know what this is, and I don't really have tools to be able to understand what it may be. We also see, for example, in this other sword that I'm now putting up on screen, we see another kind of non-easily recognizable shield that actually is quite similar to the Solothurn one, but if you see the metal pattern there, you'll actually see that it has these little circles, and this, as we well know after watching this video, means gold. And if we do a quick search of what this shield may represent, we can see that it comes from the city of Naples. So, of course, if we know that the seller is based in Italy, for example, or that the sword model is an Italian sword model, it suddenly becomes very clear to us that this is a sword from Naples. The value of heraldry in sword recognition, of course, isn't limitless. It fits a very specific set of weapons, and it's useful in certain geographical areas, and I'll explain why. But it's probably relatively unlikely that you will find a sword with a family coat of arms on it, although it's not necessarily impossible. What is more likely that you will find are city coats of arms or country coats of arms. But the country coats of arms are less useful because at a more general level, we can often tell if a sword is French or maybe Swedish or Italian. It still can be useful to determine it with more precision, but it still gives us a very broad geographical area. But when we talk about cities, this suddenly can help us pinpoint the area to a way smaller and way more specific geographical location. And when it comes to heraldry applied to cities, I'm, of course, not a worldwide expert on it, but I can tell you that it's probably the areas where you'll find the most value in looking for coats of arms is probably Switzerland, Germany, and Italy. Germany and Italy pre-unification, of course. And that is because being pre-unification countries, they're formed by a bunch of different bigger or smaller geographical entities or administrative entities that may have, as in the Swiss case, often put their canton or coat of arms on their weapons. So it'll be less likely that you see this on French swords because their markings were more standardized and more centralized. So they were uniform for the whole of France. I'm not sure about how this would work in the British Army, for example. But for sure, when we're talking about Switzerland or pre-unification Italy and probably pre-unification Germany, being able to, having this basic knowledge of heraldry and how it applies to swords can be invaluable in helping you understand what you have in your hands. And just a quick mention, heraldry, I mentioned at the start of the video, I think that we have multiple tools that we need to kind of apply or know how to apply. And close to heraldry, of course, comes the understanding of royal ciphers and monograms, and all of these, I won't talk about them in this video, but you often find them on blades. So the more you can identify the different symbols on your sword and the more you can combine them and kind of cross-reference them, the easier it becomes to kind of pinpoint the sword you are looking at down to a small window of time, just a few years, and a very precise location. And of course, when you have that information, you're more than free to, contact local archives, look up detailed regional bibliography, and that way your knowledge can really expand in ways that you might not have been able to if you didn't have this information. So I talked a lot. I hope, because there's a lot of information to convey, I hope I did that in a non-boring and not too long-winded way. I hope this was useful. I hope you can apply it to your own swords and your own research. And if you enjoyed the video, please subscribe. That's really useful. And if not, or if you do, in any case, I'll see you in the next sword video. Bye.